fields and fasting. Ireland in the Middle Ages was a land where the soil and the soul were equally responsible for what ended up on the table. The island's cool, damp climate created a countryside that seemed always half green, half grey, and its seasons dictated when people planted, harvested and stored food. Grain grew in scattered plots, oats and barley doing better than wheat, while cattle, sheep and pigs roamed the wetter pastures. But alongside this agricultural rhythm came another invisible hand, the church. Christianity in Ireland had arrived centuries earlier, and by the medieval period it was everywhere. What people ate, or more often what they did not eat, was filtered through layers of fasting regulations, feast days and penance. The average year was peppered with periods of abstinence, no meat during Lent, no butter or milk on certain days, and frequent reminders that indulgence of the body was perilously close to indulgence of the soul. To our modern eyes, it sounds like austerity piled on top of scarcity. Yet this culture of fasting gave medieval Irish food a rhythm as reliable as the harvest. A farmer might rise to a morning of oat bread and sour milk, but come the 40 days of Lent, the same table was stripped of butter and flesh. The ritual deprivation was not merely dietary, it was spiritual discipline embodied in food. And yet, medieval Ireland was not all grim self-denial. The land itself could be abundant, and cattle in particular became both wealth and sustenance. The law tracts of the early medieval Irish, the Brecon Laws, speak obsessively of cows, their value, their ownership, their milk. To have herds was to have life itself. Still, milk was rarely drunk fresh. It was churned into butter, soured into drinks, or even turned into a hard, portable cheese for travel. Butter, when permitted, was an almost sacred richness in the diet, stored in bogs to preserve it for months or even years. Archaeologists still unearth bog butter, wrapped in wooden tubs or animal skins, sometimes centuries old, a tangible reminder of how central dairy was to survival. There's also a curious detail. Fasting rules often bent under local custom. While meat was forbidden, fish was allowed, and Ireland, ringed by ocean and rivers, had plenty. Salmon leapt in season, eels writhed in nets, and shellfish lined the coasts. Yet, whether every villager actually gave up their bacon rashers when Lent demanded it is something scholars still debate. Human nature suggests many peasants took liberties when no cleric was looking. It's also worth noting the strange ways food became intertwined with politics and piety. In 1111, the Synod of Rath-Breasail formally reorganised the Irish Church, tightening discipline across the island. From that century forward, priests and bishops were pressing harder to ensure fasting rules were followed. But in practice, rural households balanced the church calendar against the stubborn demands of the stomach. Hunger was a more insistent master than Rome or Armagh. Imagine then a medieval Irish year as a pendulum swinging between fields and fasting, cattle milked in the misty mornings, grains boiled into porridge, butter treasured in dark bogs, and salmon pulled from rivers when bells rang for abstinence. Food was never simply fuel, it was part of a sacred choreography, feast and fast, permission and prohibition, nature and nurture. Peasant hearths. Step inside a thatched, low-roofed cottage in medieval Ireland, and the story of food becomes intimate. Smoke curls upward from a central hearth, escaping slowly through a hole in the roof. Around this smoky heart of the home, a family gathers. Here is where the peasant's diet, shaped by necessity rather than choice, unfolds. If kings and monks dined with ceremony, peasants ate with pragmatism. Survival was the measure of a meal. The day often began with bread or porridge. Oats were the most dependable crop, hardy in poor soils where wheat would falter. From these oats came a range of meals. Coarse flatbreads baked on hot stones, gruels simmered slowly, and even oat cakes packed for journeys to the fields. Barley too found its way into the pot, though it was considered less nourishing than oats. Wheat bread was a rarity, a luxury that peasants might never taste unless they lived near a monastery or lord's hall. Alongside grains, dairy formed the backbone of rural sustenance. Milk soured quickly, so it was transformed into buttermilk, curds, and soft cheeses. Children grew up drinking sour milk daily, and churning butter was an almost ritual task. Fresh butter was for those moments when food was plentiful, while surplus was stored in earthen pits or even preserved in peat bogs, much like the wealthy did, though on a humbler scale. A wooden churn, battered from years of use, was as vital to a peasant household as any tool in the fields. Vegetables were fewer than we might imagine today. Onions, leeks, and cabbage were known, and peas or beans might be boiled into thick stews. The hearth pot was often a cauldron that rarely cooled, its contents refreshed with whatever scraps or herbs were at hand. Meat, though, was not an everyday sight. A family might slaughter a pig once or twice a year, salting or smoking the flesh for preservation, but most days, meat was a flavouring more than a meal. Bits of fat or a strip of bacon might enrich a pot of greens, turning otherwise plain fare into something sustaining. Still, there were quirks. Archaeologists have uncovered bones suggesting that peasants occasionally ate horseflesh, though this was frowned upon by the church. Whether such meals came from desperation or practicality is unclear. Scholars still debate whether ordinary Irish peasants truly viewed horse meat as taboo, or whether clerical prohibitions were more honoured in theory than in the hunger-driven reality of the countryside. Seasonality ruled everything. In spring, when grain stores dwindled, hunger set in. This hungry gap meant families leaned heavily on milk, wild greens, and whatever fish or shellfish could be gathered. Come autumn, however, there might be abundance. Apples, berries, and hazelnuts gathered from hedgerows alongside newly harvested oats. Children would have eaten these wild foods as eagerly as sweets today. The social side of meals should not be forgotten. Peasants dined seated on stools or even on the floor, sharing from common bowls. Utensils were simple: wooden spoons, knives that doubled for work and eating. Bread was sometimes used as a scoop, porridge as both meal and utensil, and yet, despite the modest setting, there was comfort in ritual. Families said prayers before meals, acknowledging the thin line between plenty and want. To the modern palate, the peasant hearth might seem monotonous: oats, dairy, the occasional vegetable, rare meat. Yet, within that simplicity lay resilience. It was food that sustained generations, food that carried families through lean seasons and fleeting moments of plenty. The hearth, smoky and warm, was more than a kitchen. It was the centre of survival itself. Monks at table. If the peasant hearth was a smoky cauldron of necessity, the monastery refectory was a theatre of order. Imagine a long timbered hall, whitewashed walls, dimly lit by tallow lamps, the silence broken only by the scrape of wooden spoons and the low voice of a reader reciting scripture. To eat as a monk in medieval Ireland was to submit not just to hunger or taste, but to discipline. The rule of St. Benedict, which had spread across much of Europe by the early Middle Ages, shaped monastic life in Ireland too, though with local adaptations. Meals were spare, taken together, and always accompanied by readings to nourish the soul as much as the body. Silence was enforced. Monks communicated with hand signals rather than words, ensuring the meal remained part of prayer rather than indulgence. The rhythm of the day, work, prayer, study, was stitched together by these ritualized meals. What did the monks eat? Fish was central. Rivers and coastal waters provided salmon, trout, and eels in abundance. The Irish monastic fondness for eels is well documented, and archaeological digs at sites like Clonmacnoise have turned up heaps of fish bones, suggesting that fasting restrictions, which forbade meat, did not mean going hungry. The monastery pond was sometimes stocked with fish for ready supply, a kind of early aquaculture. Vegetables and grains filled out the table: cabbages, leeks, beans and peas, boiled into pottages, thickened with oats or barley. Bread, coarse and dark, was baked in communal ovens, often with little leavening. Dairy products appeared too, though with some ambivalence. Butter and cheese could be consumed, but rules often dictated restraint. Some sources hint that Irish monks allowed more dairy than their continental counterparts, though scholars still debate whether this was a reflection of necessity, since cattle culture was so central to Irish life, or of leniency creeping into strict Benedictine ideals. Curiously, certain luxuries found their way into cloisters. Honey, for instance, was prized both as food and medicine, sweetening otherwise plain dishes. Monasteries kept bees in wicker hives, producing wax for candles and honey for the table. In wealthier establishments, imported wine might be present, though strictly reserved for liturgical use. Still, one wonders how many monks, tasting that foreign sweetness, felt the temptation of indulgence. Then there were the fasts. Lent imposed strict abstinence, but in monasteries fasting could be harsher still, multiple days with only one meal after sunset, often of bread and water. It was a discipline of the body meant to sharpen the soul. And yet, human ingenuity found ways around rules. Fish, technically not meat, was often enjoyed in quantities that made fasting seem less austere. Some monastic rules even permitted eggs on certain fast days, blurring the line between denial and accommodation. Life in a monastery might seem bleak, but food also created community. Festivals and feast days brought richer fare, roasted meats on Christmas, extra honey and bread on Easter. Pilgrims arriving at great centres like Glendalough or Armagh were sometimes fed from the monastery's stores, a reminder that food was as much charity as sustenance. One quirky survival tells us how deeply food shaped monastic identity. Manuscripts occasionally contain marginalia written by monks, little side notes complaining about hunger, cold, or the monotony of meals. One scribe in the 9th century scribbled about being sick of fish, suggesting that even in holy life, the stomach had its rebellions. The monastic table, then, was a mirror of the broader medieval Irish world, rooted in fish and grain, shaped by fasting, softened by occasional indulgence. It was food as ritual, food as discipline, food as quiet resistance against the flesh, even when the flesh longed for variety. Feasts of Kings. If the monastery table whispered restraint, the royal banquet hall roared with spectacle. Step into a medieval Irish rath or a great hall within a ring fort, and the air is thick with the smell of roasted meats, wood smoke, and the sweet tang of mead. Here, food was more than sustenance. It was theatre, politics, and power. A feast was the moment when kings showed their wealth and bound their followers through belly and boast. Sources like the Brecon Laws and later Irish sagas describe these feasts in vivid detail. At the high tables sat kings, chieftains, and honoured guests, while warriors and poets filled the benches below. Each guest's portion signalled their rank. The distribution of meat, in particular, was fraught with symbolism. The champion received the curad mear, or champion's portion, usually the finest cut of pork or beef. This wasn't just dinner, it was an enactment of hierarchy, a ritualized display of loyalty and reward. What foods appeared at such feasts? Cattle, again, dominated. Beef was the noblest of meats, slaughtered for great gatherings, while pork was equally beloved. In fact, Irish literature often equates prosperity with pigs, and some tales tell of magical pigs that could be slaughtered and reborn endlessly to feed warriors. Archaeological finds at royal sites like Tara and Cashel confirm the presence of large quantities of cattle bones, many showing butchery marks that suggest organised feasting. But meat alone didn't fill the table. Bread, made from oats, barley, or imported wheat for the elite, was ever present. Butter was served in abundance, not the thin scraping of a peasant household, but thick slabs, often alongside cheeses. Fish, too, featured prominently, especially salmon and trout from Ireland's rivers. And then there were imports, salt from overseas to cure meat, wine from France or Spain, even exotic spices that try. Culled in through Norse and later Anglo-Norman trade, to sip wine in a timbered hall in Meath was to taste not only luxury, but the reach of a king's influence. Quirky details abound in the descriptions of these gatherings. One tale mentions whole pigs boiled in cauldrons the size of bathtubs, while another describes warriors gnawing marrow from roasted bones, the grease dripping onto rush-covered floors. Entertainment wove through the meals, harpers plucked strings, poets recited genealogies, and jesters provoked laughter. Food was only one part of the sensory flood. Sound, sight, and smell all announced the majesty of kingship. And yet, even within this grandeur, fasting rules and ecclesiastical oversight intruded. Clergy might attend feasts, ensuring no scandalous excess undermined Christian decorum. But whether fasting rules were strictly observed in such halls is something scholars still debate. Accounts of lavish Lenten feasts, with fish and dairy substituting for meat, suggest that kings found creative ways to balance piety with opulence. The political role of feasts cannot be overstated. A king who fed poorly risked losing followers. A generous host gained renown. Food was currency, a way to secure alliances and showcase abundance. Some chronicles describe visiting poets or envoys leaving with their horses laden not only with gifts, but with provisions, bread, butter, and salted meat, to carry the reputation of their host far beyond his hall. Imagine, then, the contrast. While peasants scraped porridge from wooden bowls within the ring fort's walls, nobles feasted on roasted beef, drank imported wine, and argued over who deserved the choicest cut of meat. This was food as theatre of power, and everyone present knew their place in the drama. Ale, milk, and mead. In a land where water could be unpredictable, sometimes pure from springs, sometimes tainted by livestock and marsh, drink mattered as much as food. Medieval Ireland's tables, from peasant hearth to royal hall, were rarely without a jug or horn of something fermented or freshly drawn. Ale, milk, and mead were more than beverages. They were cultural symbols, each tied to identity, health, and status. Ale was the everyday drink of the masses, brewed from barley or oats, sometimes flavoured with herbs instead of hops. It was mild in strength but nourishing. For peasants, ale was both liquid bread and safe hydration, a staple brewed in small batches within the home. Archaeological evidence from settlement sites, with fragments of clay vessels stained by brewing, supports the picture of a culture where nearly every household produced its own ale. Large gatherings, however, called for more ambitious brewing, cauldrons bubbling over open fires, vats stirred with wooden paddles, the scent of malt drifting across farmyards. Milk, meanwhile, was the second pillar of Irish drink culture. Fresh cow's milk was consumed, but more often it was soured deliberately into a drink called Béné Clabhair, thick and tangy, not unlike modern kefir. Buttermilk, left from churning butter, was equally common. Both were rich in protein and fat, making them vital during lean seasons when grain ran short. The Brecon Laws are full of references to milk and dairy rights, underscoring how central these drinks were to the economy. A man without cattle was a man without sustenance, and in famine years, families leaned heavily on the churn and the pail. Above ale and milk, though, hovered the aura of mead, made from honey diluted with water and fermented with wild yeasts. Mead was the drink of kings, warriors, and weddings. Its golden hue carried connotations of wealth and the divine, for honey itself was both precious and symbolic. Monasteries often kept bees, ensuring a steady source of wax and honey, but large-scale mead production was rare and reserved for elites. To be offered a cup of mead at a banquet was to be honoured. Quirky beverages also dotted the landscape. There are hints in saga literature of fermented mare's milk and herbal infusions, though whether these were common practice or poetic exaggeration is something scholars still debate. What is certain is that Irish brewers experimented with herbs like bog myrtle, heather, and even seaweed to flavour ales long before hops became common. The result would have been drinks more earthy, resinous, or bitter than what modern palates expect. Drink was social glue. In royal halls, horns of ale and mead circulated alongside roasted meats, cementing bonds of loyalty. Among peasants, a shared jug of home-brewed ale marked hospitality and kinship. Even in monasteries, where strict rules limited indulgence, ale was often permitted in moderation. One record from Clonmacnoise suggests that allowances of ale were carefully measured, yet monks still wrote marginal notes in manuscripts complaining when the drink ran thin. Alcohol also carried dangers. Drunkenness was frowned upon, though never fully eradicated. The annals of the Four Masters record instances where feasts dissolved into quarrels and bloodshed after too much drink. Yet such warnings only underline how central these beverages were. They were unavoidable, woven into both celebration and tragedy. Picture an Irish evening in the 12th century. In a farmhouse, children sip buttermilk while their parents share mugs of mild ale. In a monastery, monks sip carefully rationed beer in silence. In a king's hall, warriors lift horns of golden mead, their voices rising with song. Across all levels of society, the glass, whether humble clay cup or gilded vessel, was as essential as the loaf or cauldron, bread, porridge, and meat. If drink united Irish society, then staple foods divided it by necessity. Across medieval Ireland, 3 pillars stood on every table in one form or another: bread, porridge, and meat. Each tells us not just what people ate, but how class, scarcity, and survival carved daily life. Bread was less uniform than the modern loaf we imagine. In truth, bread in medieval Ireland meant a range of creations, from oatcakes to barley flatbreads to the rare wheaten loaves reserved for nobles and monasteries. Oats and barley, hardy in the island's damp climate, were the workhorses of peasant baking. Dough was mixed simply, grain, water, perhaps a pinch of salt, and pressed flat onto hot stones or griddles. The result was dense, coarse, and nourishing. Archaeological traces of quern stones, worn from grinding grain, show how much labour went into turning field harvests into flour. Wheat bread, by contrast, was a delicacy. Imported or grown in small pockets of fertile soil, it appeared more often in monasteries and royal halls than in cottages. For most households, porridge was the true daily bread. Oats boiled in water or milk produced a thick gruel, sometimes enriched with leeks, onions, or scraps of fat. It could be eaten at any time of day, carried in wooden bowls to the fields, or ladled from a pot that simmered constantly at the hearth. Variants existed. Sowens, a sour oat gruel fermented slightly, was tangy and filling. Sweetened with honey, it became a rare treat. Salt, scarce in some regions, was a valued addition. When available, it transformed porridge into something closer to comfort food. Meat, by contrast, was the measure of privilege. Cattle provided beef, but were rarely slaughtered for everyday meals, since their value lay in milk and breeding. When they were killed, it was usually for feasts or during winter culls when fodder ran short. Pork was more common, pigs being easier to raise and fatten. Salted pork sustained households through cold months, while fresh cuts were saved for special occasions. Sheep offered mutton, though again, wool often mattered more than flesh. Chickens and wild birds added variety, their eggs extending protein into leaner times. There are quirks hidden in this landscape. Excavations at Crannogs, artificial island dwellings, have uncovered bones of swans and cranes, suggesting that elite households dined on exotic birds we would never consider today. One law text even mentions horsemeat fines, implying that horseflesh was sometimes consumed despite clerical disapproval. Scholars still debate whether such meats were desperation fare or symbols of status, eaten to show indifference to church taboos. Preservation was key. Meat could not be wasted, so salting, smoking and drying were essential. Large cauldrons boiled joints of beef or pork, their fat rising to the surface to be skimmed off and stored. Salted strips hung from rafters, infusing cottages with a smoky tang. Bones were cracked open for marrow, ensuring nothing was left behind. Even blood found use. Puddings made from blood and oats foreshadow the modern black pudding still beloved in Ireland. Social contrast was sharpest here. In a peasant hut, porridge simmered endlessly, enriched by a strip of bacon only when fortune allowed. In a monastery, dark bread and fish dominated, with cheese or vegetables to fill the belly. But in a king's hall, the smell of roasting beef mingled with buttered bread and imported spices, filling the air with abundance. The same staples, grain, milk, flesh, were present everywhere, but their form and frequency spoke volumes about class and circumstance. Ultimately, bread, porridge and meat were less about taste than survival. Yet through them we glimpse a society where every bite, from humble oat gruel to the champion's rib of beef, carried weight. Food here was status, sustenance and memory, all boiled together in the same pot. Strange flavours. Beyond the bread, meat and ale of daily life, medieval Ireland held a surprising pantry of flavours, some familiar, some startling, and some almost forgotten. These were the accents that gave variety to the diet, the quirks that tell us people in the Middle Ages were neither as bland nor as monotonous in their eating as we sometimes imagine. Honey was the crown jewel of sweeteners. Before sugar became widely available, honey was the golden thread running through both kitchens and medicine chests. Bees were kept in woven skeps, and their honey-flavoured porridge, enriched ale, and sweetened breads for feast days. Wax was equally prized for candles, lending honey a dual role of sacred and culinary importance. It's no accident that bees appear in early Irish law tracts. Bee swarms were valuable property, their honey so significant that disputes over ownership warranted legal arbitration. Seaweed, too, was a quiet staple. On the Atlantic coast, families collected varieties like dillisk and carrageen moss. These could be eaten raw, dried, or boiled into broths and puddings. Even today, carrageen is used as a thickener, but in medieval Ireland it was also medicine, thought to cure colds and chest ailments. To a hungry farmer's child, a strip of dried seaweed might have been both snack and remedy. Herbs added character to otherwise simple dishes. Leeks, onions, garlic and wild herbs such as sorrel and nettle-flavoured stews and broths. Dill and parsley are recorded in monastic gardens, and wild mint grew freely near streams. Some plants we now consider weeds were once vital greens. Nettle soup, for instance, was common in spring, providing vitamins at the very moment when grain stores were dwindling. There were stranger delicacies still. Archaeologists have found traces of hazelnuts in many settlement sites, suggesting they were roasted or ground into pastes. Apples and berries, wild and cultivated, offered bursts of sweetness in season. Mushrooms, though riskier, appear in folklore as both food and hazard. A curious reference in one saga even describes warriors eating hazelnut-fed pork, suggesting that pigs fattened on forest nuts were considered especially fine. Whether this was common practice or literary flourish is something scholars still debate. Spices from abroad occasionally graced Irish tables too, carried along trade routes from Viking ports like Dublin and Waterford. Pepper, cinnamon and saffron appear in records from wealthy households. These were not everyday seasonings but luxuries, their presence signalling status as much as flavour. A pinch of cinnamon in a pot of stew might impress a guest as much as a jewelled brooch. Odd preservation methods also shaped flavour. Butter, buried in bogs for long-term storage, sometimes emerged with an earthy tang, almost cheese-like. Such bog butter has been discovered by modern turf cutters, still faintly edible after centuries underground. Whether people relished or merely tolerated the strong taste of aged butter is uncertain, but its existence reveals how inventive medieval households were in preserving fat. Folklore adds another layer to these flavours. Honey was linked to poetry, seaweed to healing, and certain herbs to protection against evil. Eating was never entirely separated from the supernatural. Even feasts sometimes included ritual foods, their preparation wrapped in symbolism as much as sustenance. Imagine then a medieval Irish table where porridge is sweetened with honey, nettle leaves are stirred into broth, and a wedge of sharp bog butter melts onto barley bread. To us it might seem rustic or strange, but to them it was a world of resourceful flavour, each ingredient carrying memory, meaning and place. Hunger and memory. For all the richness of feasts and the quirks of seaweed and honey, the story of medieval Irish food cannot escape its shadow. Hunger. The island's abundance was fragile, always balanced against weather, war and disease. Crops could fail, cattle herds could be raided, and a long winter could empty pantries before spring. Food was not only nourishment, it was vulnerability. Famines recur in Irish history. In the early 14th century, the Great European Famine, 1315 to 1317, struck Ireland particularly hard. Heavy rains rotted grain in the fields, and armies moving through the countryside stripped what stores remained. Chroniclers wrote of people reduced to eating horseflesh, dogs, and, in some desperate accounts, even human flesh. Whether these stories are literal or exaggerated warnings is something scholars still debate, but they reveal the terror of scarcity. In those years, food was a currency of survival, and the line between human dignity and desperation grew thin. Hunger also left imprints in law and folklore. The Brecon laws contained passages about obligations during famine. Chiefs were expected to provide for their people, monasteries to offer charity. Failure to feed one's dependents was not just a personal failing, but a legal and moral disgrace. At the same time, tales of miraculous abundance circulated, saints multiplying loaves, enchanted pigs that replenished themselves, salmon of knowledge that never ran dry. Such stories suggest how deeply people longed for security in a land where hunger was never far away. Folklore preserved memories of lean times. In stories collected centuries later, older generations still spoke of hungry gaps, those spring weeks when grain stores ran low and families relied on milk, herbs and shellfish. Children were sent to gather nettles or dig roots, practices that echo survival strategies passed down through rail tradition. Even the rhythm of fasting and feasting within the church calendar may have softened the shock of scarcity, normalizing cycles of restraint. Quirky survival foods remind us of ingenuity. Berries, hazelnuts, and seaweed provided vitamins when diets would otherwise falter. In coastal communities, limpets and periwinkles became last resort meals, boiled in seawater for salt. Archaeological finds of charred hazelnut shells in middens tell of families huddled around fires, roasting what little they had. Hunger, in this sense, shaped not just diet, but culture itself, weaving resourcefulness into identity. Memory of hunger also became political. Kings and lords who hosted lavish feasts were not only displaying wealth, but also proving they could shield their followers from want. To feed one's people in times of shortage was to earn loyalty, just as failure to do so invited rebellion. Food was power, and hunger was a weapon as much as a tragedy. Today, when we picture medieval Irish food, it is tempting to focus only on roasted meats or golden mead, yet woven into every meal was an awareness of fragility. The porridge on the hearth, the butter stored in a bog, the dried seaweed in a pouch, all were strategies against hunger. In their persistence, they remind us that food is not merely flavour or custom, but memory. a record of both feasts and famines, carried in story and tradition. Conclusion. From smoky hearths to silent monasteries, from the roar of feasting halls to the quiet desperation of famine, food in medieval Ireland was a mirror of life itself, humble, sacred, political, and fragile. The island's climate and cattle gave its people butter and milk, its rivers offered salmon and eels, and its fields provided oats and barley. Honey-sweetened porridge, seaweed-thickened broths, and ale washed-down bread. Yet alongside abundance lurked hunger, and it is in this tension that we glimpse the resilience of Irish society. What medieval Irish people ate was more than sustenance. It was ritual, memory, and identity. Their diets tell us who they were, what they valued, and how they endured. To study their food is to taste their history, at once rich, resourceful, and shadowed by the ever-present possibility of want